I was a truck driver for 4 years. Long hauls and lonely hours back and forth across the country. Truck drivers are an interesting breed, and during the pandemic, I discovered that I could no longer be one of them. You hear a lot of stories and legends from truckers while you're sucking down burnt coffee in a choke and puke, wondering what brought you to that kind of life. Some of those stories are funny and some affirm your faith in humanity, but most of them raise the hairs on your neck and make your ass suck in your shorts. There was one line of stories that I both hated hearing and at the same time couldn't get enough of. Ones that truckers don't speak of to anybody else but other truckers. Ones that always stuck with me on those long nights. Stories of murals drawn in chalk on the sides of gas stations, diners, barns, and rest stops along the middle of I-90. They're described as incredibly detailed, put there by a maniac with talented hands. The drawings depict children falling to their deaths from the sky through the clouds. The children are always screaming. They're always dressed in old-fashioned pajamas, the fuzzy kind with the little boots over their feet. One hand is clutching a ratty teddy bear with one of the eyes missing, while the other is outstretched to a faceless depiction of Peter Pan, who flies above them. Pan's entire body looks exactly how you would picture it in your head, but the face looks like it was drawn and then smeared over by the artist, leaving only a streak of color behind. It's obvious in the murals or drawings, whatever the hell you want to call them, that Pan has dropped them, dooming them to a horrible death. To the bears and the truck drivers, they're known as the Neverland drawings. Outside of the stories from other truckers, I had never, nor have I since, heard of them from anyone else. They're a sign of what's to come. The stories go that shortly after a drawing is found, a child in a nearby town will go missing in the middle of the night, their windows left open. There's never any sign that the homes are broken into. It always looks as though the kids themselves opened them, letting something in. There's never any signs of struggle. No clues at all. The bodies of the children from the murals are always found the next day somewhere in the middle of the highway. They're always found with a ratty teddy bear stuffed in the crook of their arm. Their bodies are broken as if they've been dropped from a damn airplane. Their eyes always open, looking up at the sky. I've known guys who swore they knew guys that discovered the murals and bodies over the years. The legend says that it started back in the late 30s and continues to this day. Hundreds of kids. I always thought it was bullshit, but it was a good story that somehow seemed plausible on those long nights trying to stay awake. During that damned lockdown, that highway was a lot more peaceful with a lot less morons on the road to deal with. Nice and quiet. I'd pull longer hours than I normally would. I had a haul all the way to Washington and I was making good time, but I hadn't slept in almost 2 days. It was just after midnight when I pulled into a rest stop in South Dakota to get a few hours of sleep. There were no other trucks there. I tossed and turned for a bit and I knew it was no use. I was wired as hell. I got out of the truck and stumbled my way over to the brick bathroom. The air was freezing. It was one of those colds that deadens sound, almost like a new snowfall at night. I heard a scratching noise in front of me. I figured that maybe a raccoon or something else had found some garbage. I didn't pay much attention to it. I threw open the steel door and walked to the urinals and went about my business. It reeked of piss and cigarette smoke. I reached for my zipper when something rolled across the floor and hit my foot. It was a small fat piece of green chalk. I turned to my right and there on the back wall of that bathroom was one of those drawings. It looked exactly like the stories I had heard, but somehow even far more grotesque. The falling child looked so real, but it was Pan who struck me. The face had not been smeared over. His hair was white and it hung over his face in long strands. He was smiling, a long deformed expression as if his jaw was twice as long as it should be. His eyes were yellow. The cigarette smoke hit me again. I turned toward the line of stalls. Only one of them had the door closed. I could see shoes, black and white chucks, underneath the door. Smoke seeped through the cracks of the stall. My blood ran cold. I was frozen. It was only the sensation of feeling the piss run down my leg that snapped me out of it. I ran out the door and out to my rig. Once I got inside and locked the door, I grabbed the radio. Before I could call in what I saw, the bathroom door opened. What looked like a young boy ambled out of the bathroom. He had white hair that was stained yellow toward the ends and it hung down to his shoulders and shrouded his face. He was wearing jeans and a long black coat. His hands were covered in different colors of chalk. He kept his head low. He looked young, couldn't have been more than 15 or so. I couldn't see his face too well. I was tired, but I swore that he was smiling at me, and yellow eyes glowed like fire behind that veil of stained white hair. He started walking towards me. I looked down to my right and grabbed the gun I kept under the seat. When I looked back up, the kid was gone. I looked around for a moment, but I saw nothing. I tore us out of there and called in what I saw. The cops wanted me to stay where I was, but I didn't stop driving until I was in the next town. They found the drawing, but the face of Pan had been wiped into a smear. I talked to the cops for maybe an hour before I was back on the road. I wasn't tired anymore. I just wanted out of South Dakota. The sun was coming up behind me a few hours later, barely any light, just an empty stretch of highway and a gray landscape in front of me. I had the heater blasting, but I had the window down. I had finally come to the point where I was gonna pass out on the side of the road. For a split second, I heard something coming from above. The sound of a child screaming. It got louder, and then I saw something in my headlights. A child fell from above right in front of me and hit the pavement. I'll never forget what that looked like. I'll never forget how quick that scream was silenced. I swerved and my foot slammed on the brake, but it was too late. I felt the body go underneath the wheels just before the truck rolled over. The truck grinded on its side to a halt on the highway. Once I freed myself from the seatbelt, I climbed out of the cab and ran backward along the road, gun in hand. At the back end of the trailer, I could see a small hand sticking out from underneath and a ratty teddy bear just beyond it. It was sitting up looking at me with only one eye. Something hit the ground next to me. The other eye of the teddy bear was looking back up at me. I could smell cigarette smoke in the air. I swear I heard a boy laughing out there in that cold, quiet dawn. The death of the child was ruled an accident. The likeness of the child from the drawing in the rest stop matched her perfectly. Although I told them I had watched her fall right in front of me, everybody thought I was too exhausted to be taken seriously. They figured she had been kidnapped by the young man I had seen, somehow escaped, and unfortunately ran in front of my truck. I know what I saw. That was my last ride. I've never driven on that stretch of road again. Christmas of 2007 was an event that has always stood out in my mind, and now it always will. I was 13 at the time, and that was the first and only year that Dad missed Christmas. He worked as a long-haul truck driver, and we were used to him being gone for weeks or even occasional months at a time. He always made it a point to be home for our birthdays and Christmas, however, but that year was different. Mom was worried when he said he had one final load to deliver before the holiday season. His plan was to make his delivery and then be home on the 23rd just in time for Christmas, but Mother Nature had other ideas. As fate would have it, his route from our home in Minneapolis to Billings, Montana would take him right into the heart of a looming blizzard along I-94. Snow was falling in bunches at the time, and Dad said he was debating whether or not to pull over for the night in hopes it would clear up. He decided to try and just keep going when the road made the decision for him. He was only about an hour away from Billings when his truck struck an unexpected patch of ice, causing him to lose control and slide off the road into the median. Thankfully, he wasn't injured, but his truck was wedged in nearly 2 feet of packed snow. It was around midnight when this happened. He tried everything he could to get the truck out of the snowdrift, but it was no use. Of course, his phone signal was non-existent as well, so he couldn't even call for assistance. The roads were virtually devoid of other travelers by that point as well. He radioed into a local emergency office but was told the roads were too hazardous to travel at the moment. In the end, he could do nothing but wait. Meanwhile, Christmas came and went for us, and we didn't hear anything from Dad. Mom was a nervous wreck, although she tried to hide it, while me and my 2 sisters were just sad that he wasn't there with us. Thankfully, Dad finally called late on Christmas evening. He apologized profusely for not being with us and promised he would get home as soon as possible. He did just that 2 days later, and we were relieved to have him back. He returned with a bundle of late Christmas gifts, and all was well once more. Dad was different though. He was quiet and appeared as though his mind was focused elsewhere. I didn't question him on it, but I could tell that something was troubling him. Life went on, and Dad never missed another Christmas after that. He in fact began just taking the entire month of December off to prevent anything like that ever happening again. I didn't know this at the time, but he later told me that he never drove down I-94 again. He outright refused deliveries that took him along that stretch and would take detours that added multiple hours to his trip if it meant avoiding that spot. Us kids are all grown up now, with kids of our own. My son just turned 2 and our whole family was once again together over this previous Christmas. We sat around watching as Mom and Dad lovingly spoiled their grandchildren with goodies. I don't think I've ever seen my dad with such a beaming smile. Later that night, when the sugar rush had finally worn off and the kids had gone to bed, Dad and I were left alone on the balcony. We sipped some of his whiskey and puffed on cigars as we got to talking. I'll skip over the bulk of what we talked about because that's not really why I'm here. Eventually, we started talking about his newfound retirement from truck driving, and I asked him a question which I'd never really asked before. You ever experience anything really creepy on the road? Dad was no stranger to talking about his experiences. He had infamous tales of him getting mobbed by crackheads in Atlanta, hitting a cow in Nebraska, and the things he saw while driving through Ferguson a few years back during the civil unrest. He was never shy to tell them, but this time he paused. He swished the whiskey around his glass for a moment, as if silently debating whether he wanted to tell me. I guess I might as well tell you now. He downed the remainder of his drink and clasped his hands in front of him. You remember the year I missed Christmas? By this point, I had almost entirely forgotten about it, but when he said that, a torrent of memories came spiraling back. Yeah, Mom was pissed. I replied. Dad gave a hearty chuckle at that and nodded. Oh yeah, she never let me forget it. That was that crazy blizzard, right? When your truck got stuck. Dad nodded. Yup, damn near flipped my rig that night. Ironically, that snowdrift probably saved my life just as much as it screwed me over. He then paused and broke eye contact as he contemplated his wording. That wasn't the scary part, though. Dad explained that the area he went off the road was essentially a barren wasteland. No cities or gas stations around him, just a winding expanse of road in both directions between dozens of foothills. He again mentioned he had no cell reception and wasn't sure what to do aside from just wait for someone to pass by. After a few minutes, it became apparent that wasn't going to happen. The snow fell in buckets that night, and before long it nearly reached the bottom of his door. Dad's truck at the time was a Cascadia 125 mid-roof sleeper. He had a full sleeping compartment behind the front seat and provisions to last him a few weeks if necessary. He wasn't too worried about being stranded, at least not at first. After giving up on getting his phone to work, he crawled into the bunk area of the cab and popped a DVD in his portable TV. He figured he may be stuck out there for at least the night, so he might as well just relax until help arrived. He made sure to insist that if he wanted to, he could have probably figured out a way to get his truck out if he really tried, but he was exhausted and decided to just get some sleep. He said he drifted off not long after, only to awake sometime later to complete darkness. The temperature had plummeted and he instinctually hugged his arms and felt the goosebumps lining his arms. He'd left his truck idling before he fell asleep, but it wasn't running anymore. Confused, he crawled into the front seat to find the keys still in the ignition. He twisted the key and the engine soon rumbled back to life, but something was wrong. He said the noise of the engine morphed into a gurgling, clanging mess of metal and fluid that produced a god-awful cacophony. His dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree, displaying just about every single warning light the system had. Steam began to pour from the hood vents, and the distinct smell of boiling coolant filled the air. After letting it run maybe 10 seconds, he shut it off in fear of doing permanent damage to it. He knew that something wasn't right with it and sighed as he contemplated going out into the cold night to see if he could figure out what it was. He bundled himself up tight and popped the hood. He said the night had this almost ethereal silence to it as he stepped out of the cab. His feet crunched in the snow, echoing like crashing thunder when compared to the pervasive silence. He made his way around the front and opened it up, releasing a plume of steam from within. After it dissipated a bit, he leaned in and found something which made him quite confused. Oil and coolant was splashed all over the underside of the hood, with many other parts of the engine covered in gunk as well. Dad climbed off the grill and glanced underneath the carriage, and that's when he found something truly odd. The oil pan was shredded on the bottom of the engine. He said it looked as though someone had chopped it with an axe a couple dozen times. The oil had all spilled out into the snow beneath. Clearly that was why the engine had been running so rough, but explaining how it happened was another matter entirely. He checked around the area and said it seemed like some of the oil was dripped away from the road and towards the trees. He looked closer and spied what very much seemed like footprints accompanying them. As if the winter night wasn't cold enough, that discovery really tanked his blood temperature. He quickly headed back towards his cab, but as he reached for the handle, something stopped him dead in his tracks. Something moved behind the end of his trailer, too quick to make out any physical details. It moved on two legs and was clearly no animal. Dad just froze, his fight or flight instincts seeming to stalemate within him. He thought about calling out, but said that didn't seem like a good idea. After a few seconds of silence, he made a mad dash to his cab and locked the doors behind him. After grabbing the pistol from underneath his seat, he hopped into the rear with his heart racing. He positioned himself where he was able to glance out both side mirrors, but saw no sign of whoever was behind the trailer. The radio too was out, and after trying in vain to get it to work, he sat back. It didn't make any sense to him. Even if the engine wouldn't fire up, the batteries should have had enough reserve charge to power the radio for a little while. He tried calling on Biff's cell phone too, and although managed to get it to ring a few times, it would always just cut out. Hours passed and not much of anything happened. He dozed off once or twice, but tried his best to stay awake and wait for the sun to rise. The snow had since stopped, but not a single other car had driven by since he had stopped. He figured the pass itself was closed, but hoped someone would have been by. Sometime later, he heard a noise emanate from outside. It started as a slight thump, with another soon following, then another and another. The sounds gradually grew louder, and his heart lodged in his throat as it grew nearer. Someone was on his trailer, and he didn't know what to do about it. He clutched his pistol tight, aiming it up towards the roof. Just as he was certain the person was about to reach the roof of the cab, the sound stopped. He waited there, pistol trembling in his grip for them to emerge, but they never did. Minutes turned to hours, and he never heard another sound from the roof. He said after a while he was no longer even sure whether he had heard anything to begin with. Eventually his guard slipped and the drowsiness took over. He doesn't know if this next part is related, but he's never had anything happen like it, so I figured I'd include it too. He dreamed as he slept there, but it wasn't a normal dream. He said he remembers walking through a dark forest and viewing it all with incredible vivid detail. He was completely lucid and says to this day, almost 30 years later, it was the most incredibly realistic dream he's ever had. Even looking back on it, he says it felt so real it's hard for him to distinguish it from reality. He seemed genuinely disturbed as he told me about it too. The forest he was walking through had these massive looming trees that seemed hundreds of feet tall. Twisted roots surrounded their bases, which sprouted from the ground and twisted all over like the tentacles of the kraken. He had to dip and duck around them as he moved, going further but not knowing why. As he made his way through, he started hearing this noise like the ticking of a clock. It got louder as he moved, then sure enough he found the source. A large grandfather clock ticking away in the middle of the bundle of roots. He stopped and stared at it for a moment as it ticked away. The clock's tone reverberated but began to slow. In a few moments it had began ticking much slower, and the clock itself began to melt. Suddenly he saw things emerging in the distance from behind the trees, horrible twisted creatures like the spawns of hell. The sounds of cackling and snarling swirled around him, and he began to run. He hurtled and leapt through the roots but didn't make it far. Something struck him hard from behind, knocking him onto his chest. He then awoke with a gasp, panting heavily with a cold sweat permeating his entire body. He scrambled to a seated position while on the brink of panic. His heart was throbbing so fast and hard that it ached. He took a moment to compose himself, and the immense relief that overcame him was one of sheer relief, but it did not last. Something moved at his window and his eyes shot up. There he saw the face staring back at him. He froze, as stiff as a corpse and cold as a glacier. Tom seemed to stand still then, but finally he found the strength to raise his pistol. He fired without really even thinking. A loud bang reverberated in and the muzzle flare momentarily disoriented him. He looked up to see a bullet hole in the window and no sign of the face. After waiting there a few moments, he ventured to the driver's seat and peered out, but there was nothing there. No sign of that thing ever being there. It didn't make sense to him as he was certain he saw it. What made even less sense was the fact that his phone read that it was only 12:13 a.m. Last he remembered checking his phone, it read 12:08 a.m. and he swears on everything that had to have been at least an hour before he dozed off. By this point in his story, I had to question myself on whether he was pulling my leg. My father is a bit of a prankster for sure, but he's never weaved an elaborate story like this before. He then spent some time glancing around out the windows and ensuring no one else was around. He almost thought he should just leave his truck and start walking back to town, but obviously that was an incredibly dangerous notion that probably would have gotten him killed. He stared at his phone for quite a while, watching the minutes slowly tick onward, too slowly. He swore time wasn't working as normal. Several times he counted aloud to 60, doing his best to approximate a minute, but the minute didn't change accordingly. He eventually just kept counting upwards, finding the minute finally changed when he reached 386. You'd think that after all these worrying discoveries that sleep would have been the last thing he wanted, but it wasn't enough to prevent. He said he tried adamantly to resist the urge, but the drowsiness that overtook him was impossible to fight. He found himself walking in the snow, listening as it crunched beneath his feet. A dark and silent forest surrounded him in all directions. It was robotic, as if his body acted of its own accord while his mind drifted in the doldrums. He could barely see where he was going, but it didn't seem to matter. Suddenly he stopped and seemed to spring back to reality. He glanced around side to side, a sudden terror gripping him. Where was he? Why was he outside of his truck? He wondered. He spun back, but couldn't even see the road behind him. The cold sunk into him, and then he saw it. From further in the woods, a familiar face stared back, pale, gaunt, and inhuman. It crawled on all fours, shimmering and shifting side to side. My father turned the complete other way and ran like hell. Tree branches raked against him as he fled half-blind away from the thing in the woods. Nothing looked familiar, and he just continued running aimlessly through the woods, checking behind him periodically to see if the thing was following him. He never saw it or heard it, but he knew it was there. Eventually, he smelled the faint scent of smoke lingering in the air. He followed it, hearing a commotion behind him, and soon came across a small clearing. In the center of it was a log cabin with smoke trickling from the chimney. Seeing no other option, he dashed towards it and knocked on the door. Behind him, he could hear odd sounds coming from the woods, and thankfully the door opened a few seconds later. "Who are you? What do you want?" The voice of elderly man called from within. Dad turned and saw the barrel of a shotgun aimed at his chest. He slowly raised his hands to convey he meant no threat. "Please, sir, he said. He paused as he thought that certainly this man was going to think he was some lunatic, but he said it anyways. "There's something out there." The man's furious glance reverted to one of intrigue. He then looked past my dad and out into the forest, his eyes suddenly growing wide. Suddenly he backed up, still aiming the shotgun at my dad while waving him inside. He pointed him over to a chair in the corner. Dad complied and sat as the man locked up behind him. He waited there a couple seconds there, but apparently heard nothing of concern. "What are you doing out here?" My dad then told him what had happened with his truck and the blizzard. He then told him about the odd occurrences that had happened later on, which culminated in him suddenly sleepwalking through the woods. The man sighed and finally lowered his shotgun. He got my dad some water and took a seat across from him. "Lot of weird things in these woods." Dad paused as he waited for the man to continue. The man formally introduced himself as Duncan and said his family had owned that plot of land for nearly 100 years. He said he lost count of how many search parties had come through over the years, as well as thrill seekers, ghost hunters, and generally odd people. "I saw a face," Dad finally confessed to him. Duncan eyed him curiously. "What kind of face?" Dad described it much as he had before, and Duncan just shook his head. "Well, that's a new one." He let out a sarcastic chuckle then. "You hear all kinds of stories. UFOs, Bigfoot, cults, but none of them can ever provide proof. "So you don't believe in any of it?" my dad asked, only to be countered by Duncan. "Of course I do. I've lived out here long enough to know that we humans do not dictate these woods. There are things that lurk in shadows all over the globe and we may never understand them. But as for what you saw," he paused for a moment, seeming to contemplate as he folded his hands on his lap. "There's a group of Native Americans that are rumored to have once lived here, the Apulcarai. Ever hear of them?" Dad shook his head. "Neither had I, but a friend of mine who has since passed told me about him. He was an Arapaho man himself and said that for generations his people had told tales of these Apulcarai. Most other groups feared them, said the things they did were evil, more so than the standard tribal warfare one would expect. People say they held these rituals and experiments and were rumored that their cruelty was matched only by their intellects. Some people say they weren't even human, but that's neither here nor there." Duncan trailed off once more, taking a sip of tea from his side table. "One of the rumors that many people attribute to the Apulcarai is that of the wrong ones. A lot of names for em really, not rights, liars and uncannies. Things that look human but ain't, and some look less human than others. Long faces, wide mouths, huge eyes, a lot of variations. Some say they can affect time and space itself, and others blame them for a lot of weird disappearances." He paused and took another sip, then chuckled. "I can't speak to the validity of all that firsthand, but things for certain. There are a lot of weird disappearances and no one seems to have an answer for them." The air from the room seemed to deflate from his torso and Dad eyed the curious man. He'd clearly seen a lot over his time, but Dad didn't know how much of his tales to believe. He still doesn't. "If all these things are happening, then why do you live out here?" Dad finally asked. Duncan reclined in the seat and thought. Dad expected an answer related to his inherited property, but the reality was a bit different. He did in fact mention his ancestral home being part of it, but had more to say. "If I was 20 years younger, maybe I would leave, but I don't think it'd matter. There ain't a place on earth you could run to if they wanted to get you." Dad said. A shiver descended his spine then, and Duncan didn't seem boastful or wild as he spoke, but more as though his realization was just a foregone conclusion. Thankfully, Duncan allowed my dad to stay the night, and in the morning the two of them made their way back to the road. Luckily, Duncan had a big Dodge diesel that was able to plow through the snow with relative ease. They soon reached my dad's abandoned rig, finding it in even worse state than he'd last seen it the previous night. Multiple tires were slashed, windows were broken, and the engine was absolutely shredded from the bottom. After looking around though, he found nothing had actually been stolen. Duncan gave him a ride into town to get his truck towed, and a week or so later he was finally headed home. "So, do you believe in that kind of stuff?" I finally asked him after he seemed to be done retelling his story. "Well, I'd be kinda stupid not to now." He and I both laughed at that, but clearly he had more he wanted to say. "It was a really weird experience for sure, but I've always thought that maybe I misremembered it or subconsciously exaggerated it in my mind. Something about it though is just so haunting. Like I saw something that night that I really wasn't supposed to see and never want to see again." He just sat there for a moment in silence, and I figured it best not to ask him any more questions. He eventually told me that between the time of him crashing his truck to when he finally made it into town with Duncan, that 3 entire days had passed. He still doesn't know how to account for that, and apparently Duncan didn't either. There's a lot of unanswered questions to this that he may never get the answer to now. He kept in touch with Duncan over the years, but unfortunately he passed away back in 2019. I love my dad, and it's disconcerting seeing him that way, confused and terrified. I cannot completely attest to the validity of his story, but I believe him. For many who read this, I'm sure it will just amount to words on a paper, or maybe a fictitious story that entertained you for a few minutes, but to me it's a horrific possibility at the very least. If anyone has any experiences like this or theories, then feel free to share them. Whatever the case, you won't catch me anywhere near I-94 in Billings anytime soon. Road rage has always been something that has boggled my imagination. Here you are, hurtling down a road, 50, 60, 80 miles an hour in some cases, and everyone is in a big-ass hurry to get somewhere, and how fucking dare you get in my lane at this precise moment? It's insanity. I've been guilty of it myself a time or two, but when I say mine might be a little more justified than yours, hear me out. A fully loaded semi typically weighs in the vicinity of 80,000 pounds. That's about 38 metric tons for my readers anywhere but the US. Now, this same semi, traveling at highway speeds 55 to 75 miles per hour depending on your location, requires at least the length of 3 football fields to come to a safe and complete stop. This is in optimal conditions of sunshine and dry, flat roadways. Still, people feel the need to play chicken with a fully loaded rig by cutting us off and stopping short in front of us. I was traveling down I-43 from Green Bay, Wisconsin on my way to a rail yard in Chicago carrying a load of 10-foot paper rolls that weighed a total of 44,000 pounds. I did this run sometimes twice a day if it was timed just right and I didn't hit any major traffic snarls. I usually prefer to drive at night because there's less traffic, and that was the case this time around. Let's be honest, if you've ever driven through the Chicago or Milwaukee areas, the best time to do so is around 3 a.m. It's enough time for the majority of the drunks to have weaved their ways home from the bars, and rush hour doesn't start for another 3 hours or so. If you've never done it at this hour, I suggest you give it a try. It's rather nice. I was just passing Kohler, Wisconsin, and if you're thinking that name sounds vaguely familiar, it should. Take a look at your bath or kitchen fixtures, they might have Kohler emblazoned across them. It's what used to be referred to as a company town, where a manufacturer or mine or lumber company founded a town for whatever reason of the location and whatnot. I only mention the town because this is where the insanity started. I had pulled to the highway and into a truck stop just outside Kohler. It was between 1:30 and 2 a.m. and aside from the trucks that were parked there overnight and the attendants, there was only 2 other people there. One was a morbidly obese woman in what I can only guess is a lavender muumuu. She was cruising the candy aisle and it appeared that her ample backside had devoured a good portion of the garment. The other was a guy of about my age, height, and build. He looked so much like me, in my opinion, that it was a little unnerving. It wasn't just me, the girl at the counter looked from me to him and back. You guys brothers or something? I shook my head and paid for my purchases and was about to leave when I saw the guy staring at me. I didn't like the look he was giving me, so I got out of there and climbed back in my truck. I made sure to lock the doors as the guy followed me out and slid into a maybe Ford Taurus or a Honda Accord, I can't recall, and just sat there. I waited for the guy to leave first, but he didn't go anywhere until I did. I'm a supremely suspicious person to begin with, having been raised by a federal employee who was paranoid about his employer and having that government conspiracy crap force-fed to me for 18 years. Couple with that one of the symptoms of PTSD called hypervigilance, and you've got a cocktail for cuckoo puffs. Okay, maybe this guy wasn't looking at me like he wanted to eat my children, but he set off my spidey senses when he pulled out of the lot right behind me and then onto the highway where he could have passed me at any time since my shitty company truck was governed at 63 miles per hour. That's right, kids. I couldn't even go speed limit if I wanted to. This guy couldn't be following me, unless he was trying to draft off my trailer and save himself a few miles per gallon. I pulled off the next exit and he followed me. I drove straight through at the intersection to the other ramp and back onto the highway, and this guy still followed me. What the fuck? Was this guy looking to rob me or jack my load? He was going to be supremely disappointed when he discovered he just robbed someone for a couple of giant rolls of paper instead of some truck headed for a Best Buy warehouse. I figured that my best bet would be to just keep driving and ignore the guy. If I was rolling, he'd have a hard time trying anything. So that's just what I did. The guy just sat there in my rear view for the next 40 miles, changing lanes when I did, never exceeding 63 miles per hour. When we got closer to Milwaukee, his behavior changed. He pulled up alongside my cab and just rode right there for a few miles and then in front of me where he took his foot off the gas. I just changed lanes, but so did he. What's this guy thinking? He's going to get me to stop. I finally got by him when I stopped using my turn signals. He couldn't anticipate my movements. He sped up to get out ahead of me again, so I took the next exit unannounced and he couldn't get over to follow me in time. I took a couple turns off the highway as quickly as my size and mass would safely allow and parked, calming myself. I kicked myself thinking, why didn't you call the cops, dumbass? I knew the area, but I wanted to get this load down to Chicago before the assholes, well, the other assholes hit the road. I made my way back to the highway and continued on south. There were still little to no cars on the road, so I got my rig back up to speed and settled in for the ride. I passed what I thought was a car broken down on the side of the highway until its lights blazed on and it roared to life onto the highway. My first thought was that it was an unmarked highway patrol, and I glanced down at my speedometer. Stupidly, I couldn't speed through a 65 miles per hour zone, not unless there was a downhill, which it wasn't. No flashing lights, no signaling me of any sort. The car just settled in behind me, then it dawned on me, oh man, not this motherfucker again. This time I grabbed my Bluetooth headset and dialed 911. They answered on the second ring. 911, what is your emergency? Hi ma'am, I'm not sure if it's exactly an emergency to be honest, but I'm a truck driver and I've had the same vehicle following and harassing me for the last 40 miles. I got off the highway and thought I lost him a ways back, but he was waiting on the berm for me and he's at it again. What's your location and cell number, sir? I gave her both. I have a state highway patrol car about 4 miles south of you and I'll be dispatching them in your direction, sir. Just keep calm and continue driving safely. I'll stay with you until the officer has reached your location. I thanked her and it seems my harasser picked that moment to come up alongside me again. He's moving up again. I think he may try to get me to stop again. She remained calm, sir. Whatever you do, do not stop for that vehicle. Exasperated, I shouted, what the fuck am I supposed to do? Hit him. He's in front of me again. This time he slammed on his brakes and I nearly rear-ended him but swerved into another lane and got around him, which isn't the easiest thing to do when you weigh 80,000 pounds. I was describing what was going on to the 911 dispatcher and I'm pretty sure I sounded a bit terrified because she was telling me to remain calm. Lady, this guy is actively attempting to run me off the road. I got back up to 63, but up ahead flashed the signs to slow down for a 45 miles per hour curve coming into the Milwaukee metro area. The speed listed on signs like that is a guideline for cars, meaning that I'd need to slow even further. Now, I'm not sure if this guy didn't see the warning signs of if he didn't care, because as we were coming up to the curb he was passing me on the right at what I guessed to be 70 miles per hour. He was maybe 150 feet into the curb ahead of me when he locked up his brake and yanked the wheel to the left, which didn't make any sense in retrospect in a right-hand turn. The result was instant and catastrophic. It was almost as if the world slowed to 1/8 its regular speed. The vehicle seemed to cease all forward movement as left rear corner lifted into the air and its tires left the ground. I dropped out of gear and stood on my brakes as hard as I could. I had just come out of the curve, but I still had to worry about the trailer coming around on me. The bottom of the car loomed ahead of me as it continued its rotation, now no more than 20 feet from my front bumper. I flicked my eyes to my side mirrors. My trailer was still straight behind me, so I focused forward again as the car had now made almost one full rotation through the air. I saw the driver and his eyes seemed to bore into me, his face without expression. And then he rotated out of sight again as the car rolled 3 more times, the world returning to real time as I finally came to a halt. The car resting on its roof about 10 feet from my front driver's side bumper. I threw the truck in reverse so I could see the car from a safe distance. About a quarter mile ahead on the other side of the concrete barrier, the flashing red and blue of the state trooper's car came into view. He came screeching to stop and exited his vehicle. Sir? Are you still there? I'd completely forgotten the dispatcher was still on the phone with me. Yes, I'm here. I'm okay, the car. I couldn't find words. Sir, the officer should be on the scene now. Do you want me to stay on the line? I let her go and turned my attention to the cop, hopping over the barrier as 2 more patrol cars came roaring around the curve and came to a stop on either side of my rig. I realized my hands were still in a death grip on the wheel. I pulled them away. My arms were on fire. I put the parking brake on and opened my door. Sir, please stay in the vehicle until we secure the scene. A Milwaukee cop hollered to me from the rear driver's side of my trailer. I left the door but stayed where I was. The trooper had jogged to the overturned car and was flashing his flashlight inside. He stood up, turned in a careful circle, looking confused, and then came toward my truck. "Sir, did you see which way the driver went?" "I'm sorry, what?" "The driver of the car. He directed his beam on the vehicle. Did you see which way he went?" My brain was still trying to understand what the hell he was asking me. "I didn't see anyone get out. What are you talking about?" "There's no one in the car, sir." I let that sink in for a second. "Officer, that car wasn't driving itself." As he walked away, he held up a finger telling me to wait where I was, and he conferred with the other police officers as I heard the wail of other sirens rushing to the crash. The cops spread out, one of them getting in his car, turning around and driving the wrong way on the highway until he was just out of sight around the curve and turned around. The alley lights on his cruiser shining into the grass on the side of the road as he drove at a snail's pace, searching for signs of an injured driver. I saw an ambulance and a full crew on a fire truck arrive along with more patrol vehicles to direct all traffic that would be coming into the 2 lanes furthest to the right. I seemed to have been forgotten as the officers searched for the driver of the car. I called my night freight dispatcher and told her what was going on, followed by a chorus of "oh shits" and "what the fucks" from the other dispatchers and their immediate supervisor in the background. They told me to sit tight and update them when the cops gave me more info. They'd inform the paper mill that their load was going to be late to the rail yard and schedule a new drop time when they knew what was going on. Finally, 2 of the cops came up to my vehicle to talk to me. One was the state trooper who'd been first on the scene. They performed a breathalyzer test on me that came up with 0, as expected. They asked to search my vehicle for anything like narcotics, which I consented to. This was all standard shit after an accident. They inspected my vehicle for damage. Top to bottom, there was none to be found as I'd had the good fortune to miss the car entirely. It was registered to a guy in Kohler, but they were unable to reach the owner. We sat there for hours going over everything, and when a wrecker finally showed up to retrieve the damaged car, they attached a cable to the car to get it flipped over to its wheels. But when it rolled onto its side, the trunk flew open and something thumped to the ground out of my line of view. The cop closest to the recovery driver yelled for him to stop as he approached what had fallen out of the trunk. "Ah fuck," was all I heard him say, but his face spoke volumes of revulsion. He walked over to his patrol car and grabbed a white plastic, folded sheet and draped it over the back of the car, obscuring any view of what had been in there. I was given back my IDs and my report had been taken. I was told I could leave the scene and that they'd contact me if they needed any information. As I slowly pulled away, I glanced in the direction of the sheet and saw a brownish-red ooze-like substance seeping out from under it. I never heard from the cops for more info. It was a night like any other on the desolate highways that crisscrossed through the heart of nowhere. My name's Jake, and I'm a truck driver, been hauling cargo through the lonesome roads for over a decade. The kind of life that keeps you company with the hum of the engine and the endless stretch of asphalt. That night, I found myself on a particularly eerie stretch of road, swallowed by an impenetrable fog. The kind that wraps around you like a suffocating shroud, concealing the world beyond. The only companions were the dim glow of my headlights cutting through the mist and the rhythmic beat of raindrops on the roof of my rig. I'd heard rumors on the CB radio about this stretch, a place where truckers whispered of abandoned cars, tales of drivers gone missing without a trace. It was enough to send shivers down the spine of even the most seasoned drivers, but I'd always scoffed at such stories. That is until that night. As I maneuvered through the winding road, the fog became denser, almost palpable. Visibility dropped to a few feet ahead, and the low hum of the engine seemed swallowed by an oppressive silence. The glow of my headlights refracted off the mist, casting eerie shadows that danced like wraiths in the night. It was then that I saw him, a silhouette on the side of the road. A man, or so it seemed, standing motionless in the fog. My instincts told me to keep going, but the human in me wanted to lend a helping hand. I eased off the gas, and the truck rolled to a stop beside him. He was oddly pale, and the fog clung to his form like a ghostly cloak. But what sent a shiver down my spine were his eyes, big, round, and as black as the void itself. His mouth, a gaping maw, stretched wide in a manner that defied the laws of anatomy. I hesitated, a chill crawling up my spine. Something was terribly wrong. The man-creature didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence. He just stood there, staring into the fog. With a lump in my throat, I decided to get going. But as I revved up the engine, I glanced back at him. That's when I saw it, the twisted, grotesque smile that curled on his featureless face. Panic surged through me and I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, leaving the fog-draped figure behind. As I drove away, I grabbed the radio mic to share my unsettling encounter with fellow truckers. But to my dismay, the once buzzing airwaves were silent. No static, no voices, just an unsettling void that mirrored the fog outside. The road seemed endless and I pushed the accelerator harder, the engine roaring in protest. I needed distance from that creature, needed the safety of the city lights. But as the miles blurred together, the fog persisted, unyielding. I drove way over 100 miles and was sure that creature was far away and I will never met it again. In the distance, a lonely parking lot emerged and I decided it was time to pull over. The weariness and fear clawed at me and I desperately needed a moment to collect myself. I shut off the engine, closed the curtains, and tried to shake off the encounter as mere imagination. Little did I know that the night had only just begun and the horrors lurking in the fog were far from done with me. I tried to convince myself that it was just fatigue playing tricks on my mind. I locked the doors, closed the curtains, and nestled into my bunk, hoping that the haunting image of that pale figure with the unnaturally large eyes and twisted smile would fade away with the night. But sleep remained elusive. After what felt like hours of tossing and turning, a sense of impending doom washed over me, jolting me awake. A shiver ran down my spine as I fumbled to open the curtains. The parking lot was bathed in an eerie glow from the flickering overhead lamps, casting long shadows that seemed to dance in the fog. That's when I saw them again, 3 of those nightmarish creatures. They stood like sentinels, their dark eyes fixed on the truck. Panic gripped me as I fumbled to turn on the cabin lights, revealing their ghastly features in all their horrifying glory. Their mouths, wide open, emitted guttural growls that reverberated through the metal walls of the truck. The air in the cabin grew thick with an otherworldly presence, a malevolence that seeped through every pore of my being. I reached for the ignition, praying that the truck would roar to life and carry me far away from this nightmare. But nothing happened. The engine remained silent, as if in protest against the encroaching terror. The creatures, sensing my vulnerability, began to advance. Their movements were unsettlingly smooth, almost as if they were gliding across the asphalt. The growls intensified, echoing through the desolate parking lot. I could feel the cold sweat trickling down my back as desperation set in. My hands trembled as I repeatedly turned the key, willing the engine to respond. The growls escalated into a cacophony and the creatures closed in, their features contorted in a grotesque display of hunger. Just as the creatures were about to reach the truck, a surge of relief washed over me as the engine roared to life. I slammed the gear into drive, the truck jolting forward, leaving the creatures behind in the rearview mirror. As the truck sped away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the creatures were not bound by the laws of the physical world. Their terrifying growls echoed in the distance, even as the city lights finally emerged on the horizon. I dared a glance back, and to my horror, I saw the creatures running after the truck with unnatural speed, far beyond anything human. It was as if the shadows themselves were chasing me. As I drove into the welcoming glow of city lights, the creatures abruptly halted. Their twisted forms lingered at the edge of the urban sprawl, their growls fading into the night. Relief mingled with a lingering dread as I realized they had a boundary, a limit to their reach. I parked the truck in a well-lit area, surrounded by the comforting hum of civilization. My hands trembled as I reached for the radio mic once more, hoping to connect with someone, anyone. But the static-filled airwaves remained stubbornly silent. The city lights seemed to push back the darkness, but I couldn't shake the feeling that those creatures were still out there, waiting in the shadows for their next opportunity to strike. The night was far from over, and the road ahead held more horrors than I could fathom. I spent the restless hours of the night parked in that well-lit haven, the city lights warding off the encroaching darkness. But no matter how brightly the urban landscape glowed, the images of those nightmarish creatures lingered in the recesses of my mind, their growls echoing like a sinister melody. As dawn began to break, I couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare was far from over. I pulled back onto the road, my eyes scanning every shadow, every patch of fog with a newfound paranoia. The city lights gradually faded in the rearview mirror as the road stretched into another desolate expanse. My radio crackled to life, the sudden sound making me jump. It was a voice, a fellow trucker. "Hey, you there? You okay?" The voice sounded concerned, and I eagerly responded, recounting the horrors of the night, the fog-shrouded figures, the broken radio, and the unrelenting pursuit. There was a pause on the other end, and then the voice spoke, heavy with a mix of fear and disbelief. "You're not alone. We've all heard those stories, the abandoned cars, the creatures in the fog. But we always thought they were just stories." The revelation sent a chill down my spine. I wasn't the only one who had faced those monstrous entities. The radio buzzed with hushed conversations among truckers, each sharing their own encounters with the supernatural on this stretch of road. The stories varied, but a common thread emerged. Those creatures, with their haunting eyes and twisted smiles, were a malevolent force that seemed drawn to the lonely roads in the dead of night. No one knew their origin or their purpose, but they left a trail of fear in their wake. As I continued my journey, the unease persisted. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, and the fog clung to the edges of the highway like a malevolent specter. I couldn't shake the feeling that those creatures were watching, waiting for the opportune moment to strike again. The radio chatter intensified, with truckers exchanging advice on how to avoid the creatures, sharing tales of those who had disappeared without a trace. The fear was palpable, a shared experience that bound us together in the face of the unknown. With each passing mile, the city lights became a distant memory. The road ahead was swallowed by an impenetrable fog, and the radio once again fell silent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. As I approached the familiar stretch where I first encountered the creatures, a sense of dread settled over me. The fog thickened, and the atmosphere grew heavy with the weight of unseen eyes. Then, a haunting realization struck me. This road was a loop, an unending circuit that brought travelers back to the heart of the supernatural. The city lights, the camaraderie on the radio, all illusions meant to deceive. The creatures weren't bound by distance, they were bound by time, forever haunting those who dared traverse this cursed stretch. A guttural growl echoed through the fog, and the twisted figures emerged once again. Their black eyes bore into my soul, their gaping mouths emitting an otherworldly wail. I slammed my foot on the gas pedal, the engine roaring in protest, but the truck seemed tethered to the nightmarish loop. As the creatures closed in, the fog swallowed everything, and the road became an unending void. The last thing I saw were those eyes, an abyss that seemed to consume all light. The radio crackled to life one final time, a chorus of terrified voices screaming a warning. But it was too late. The creatures closed in, and the world descended into darkness. And so, the haunted highway claimed another victim, lost to the eternal night and the malevolent creatures that lurked within the fog. The loop continued, a never-ending cycle of horror, trapping the unwary in an unending nightmare. The road stretched on, shrouded in fog, a haunted path that few dared to traverse and even fewer escaped.